Boat ramps sitting on cracked, sun-baked grass, jetties pointing at nothing. That's Choke Canyon Reservoir right now, one of the two lakes that keep 500,000 people in Corpus Christi, Texas alive, sitting at roughly 8% capacity, the lowest combined storage this system has ever recorded. City officials told reporters they are not at risk of running out of water. Meanwhile, draft council plans obtained by journalists propose 25% mandatory cutbacks for the entire region. And the city's billion-dollar fix? They built it, killed it at 1 a.m, revived it, then killed the funding too. I work with reservoir systems and water utilities for a living, and I want to say something up front that's going to sound harsh. None of what I just told you is a drought story. It's dressed up as one. Every headline treats it like weather did this to Corpus Christi. Weather is the trigger. It is not the cause. And by the end of this, I think you're going to agree with me, because the paper trail on this thing is one of the messiest I've looked at in a long time. Let me give you a sense of what this reservoir actually is, physically, before we get into the paperwork, because the scale matters. When Choke Canyon is full, it holds water across roughly 26,000 surface acres with about 135 miles of shoreline. It's managed by the Bureau of Reclamation, and it supports a real recreational economy: black bass, largemouth bass, striper, crappie, catfish, year-round fishing, boat ramps, camping. That's not a decorative detail. That's tourism dollars and local jobs sitting on top of a drinking water supply. When people talk about the lake drying up, they're usually picturing an abstraction. What's actually drying up is boat ramps built for 135 miles of shoreline that now serve a fraction of that, anglers who can't launch, and a local economy that quietly absorbs damage nobody's putting a dollar figure on in these council meetings. Let's start with the number, because the number itself is a trick. In January of 2026, the city put out a release saying combined storage across Choke Canyon and Lake Corpus Christi had hit 10%, described, in their own words, as the lowest level in the system's history. Okay? Historic low. Sounds like the bottom. Except by May, it wasn't 10% anymore. It was somewhere between 8.5 and 8.7. So the historic low from January got beaten within 4 months. That's not a plateau. That's a system still falling after they'd already told the public it had bottomed out. Here's where it gets stranger. The trigger for an actual water emergency in this city isn't tied to that percentage at all. It's tied to something called a 180-day forecast. Basically, the point where the city projects it's about 6 months away from demand outrunning supply. That's an internal planning number. It's not the number you see in the headline. So you've got two completely different instruments measuring two completely different things, and the public only ever sees one of them, the scary lake photo, not the demand curve underneath it. And that's exactly why the emergency declaration date has been able to slide around so much. It went from November to September, back out to December, not because the lake changed its mind, because the metric driving the decision isn't the metric being shown to the cameras. There's a second layer to that same trick. The city's own drought contingency plan has stage trigger points, and Corpus Christi has been sitting in stage 3, the most severe standing designation before a formal emergency for a long stretch of this crisis. Under that plan, once the western reservoirs drop below 10%, there's no additional mandatory action automatically required. Read that again. The plan's own language says the western reservoir levels alone do not determine when a water emergency takes effect. So the city can be at a historic low in its most severe standing drought stage and still not be required to do anything differently, because the plan was written to key off the demand forecast, not the water actually sitting in the lake. That's not a conspiracy. That's just a plan that was drafted assuming the lake level and the demand forecast would move together. In a fast draining system, they don't. Now, I want to be fair here because I don't think anyone lied. A spokesperson told a reporter the city wasn't at risk of running out of water, and technically, using their internal model, that might be true. But not literally dry taps tomorrow, and not a crisis are two very different claims, and collapsing them into one soundbite is where public trust gets hurt. That's the first crack in the official story, and it's a small one. It gets bigger. Go back further, and this stops looking like bad luck entirely. Choke Canyon dropped from 47% capacity in October of 2021 to 11% by October of 2025. 4 years. That is not a flash flood scenario. That is a slow, monitored, publicly trackable decline that anyone with access to water data for Texas could have watched happen in real time, month by month, for 4 straight years. Rainfall in the region has been running under 60% of normal. A drought that lasts that long isn't a surprise anymore by year 2. It's a forecast. And the fact that this is still being treated administratively like sudden bad news in year 5 is the first real aha moment in this whole story. The system wasn't ambushed. It watched itself run dry in slow motion and kept operating on assumptions from a wetter decade. That's the mechanical root of it, and I want to explain it plainly because it's not complicated, it's just uncomfortable. Corpus Christi's water rights and industrial supply commitments were built around the hydrology of a wetter period. When you commit water to refineries, to chemical plants, to new industrial customers based on how much rain used to fall, and then the rain stops falling at that rate, there's no built-in mechanism that automatically shrinks those commitments to match reality. The paperwork doesn't renegotiate itself. The reservoir does the renegotiating for you, by running out. That's what's actually happening here. It's a synchronization failure between a climate system and a permitting system, and reservoirs are just where that gap becomes visible to the public. Okay, so if the drought was foreseeable, the next question is obvious. What did the city actually do about it? And this is where the story stops being about weather completely and becomes a story about a machine. In 2019, the city put forward a plan for a seawater desalination plant, the Inner Harbor Project, 30 million gallons a day, described by the city manager as drought-proof. I want to sit on that word for a second, because drought-proof is a big promise for a piece of equipment that hadn't been built yet. The original cost estimate in 2019 was $160 million. By 2024, when the actual construction contract was awarded to Kiewit Infrastructure South, the price had climbed to $757 million. By July of 2025, it was $1.2 billion. Read that progression again. $160 million, then $220, then $757, then $1.2 billion. That's not one overrun. That's 4 distinct jumps across 6 years. When a cost estimate moves that many times, that dramatically, it's not inflation doing that. Inflation is smooth. This is jagged. And jagged cost curves usually mean one specific thing in infrastructure. The project never had a stable, locked-down diagnosis of what it actually needed to be. Scope kept changing. Capacity assumptions kept changing. The site conditions, the discharge requirements, the permitting terms, something kept moving underneath the number, and every time it moved, the number moved with it. So in September of 2025, after a public meeting that ran 13 hours and ended with a vote at 1 in the morning, the city council killed it. Canceled the Kiewit design contract at only about 10% completion. $50 million spent, mostly for nothing. The mayor called it, and I'm using her actual words, $50 million in the toilet. I want you to notice what that phrase is actually admitting. It's not framed as we lost $50 million because our engineering process failed to stabilize the design. It's framed as regret over a canceled purchase. That's a subtle but real difference. One version says the money was wasted by bad management. The other implies the money was wasted by the vote itself. Listen for that kind of reframing throughout this story, because it happens constantly. Here's where I'd expect the story to end if this were a normal infrastructure failure. Project too expensive, city kills it, City moves on to something cheaper. That is not what happened. By June of 2026, 9 months after killing it, the same council voted 7-2 at 2:20 in the morning after a 15-hour meeting to reconsider the exact same plant, now requoted at roughly $979 million. Same footprint, same basic technology, new number, still north of the original by more than 6 times. One council member, Eric Cantu, said publicly that the project had gotten so political, so nasty, with threats involved. I don't think that's just color commentary for a news story. I think that's a direct admission that this decision was being run on political headcount, not engineering sequence. You don't get a stable water infrastructure decision by taking 3 public votes on the same asset within a single year. You get a coin flip that happens to have concrete poured into it eventually. And then, less than a month after reviving it, on June 30th, the council declined, 5-4, to even apply for a federal grant that could have covered up to $120 million of the cost. Killed, revived, definanced. 3 reversals inside about 10 months on a project that's supposed to be the backbone of the city's water future. If you're keeping score, that's not indecision. That's a governance structure that cannot hold a single position on its own most important infrastructure project long enough to build it. Now let's go to the part that almost nobody outside the city talks about because it's less flashy than the price tag, but it matters just as much from a water science standpoint. What happens to the water this plant would spit out as waste? Desalination doesn't make salt disappear. It concentrates it. The brine byproduct from a plant like this can run roughly twice as salty as ordinary seawater, and the current proposal would discharge millions of gallons of that concentrate into Corpus Christi Bay, a mostly enclosed coastal system that supports fish, crabs, and seagrass beds. The city hired an outside firm, Spheros Environmental Group, to study the ecological impact, and that study concluded the discharge would not disrupt the bay's ecosystem. Here's my honest professional reaction to that. I'm not saying the study is wrong. I don't have the underlying methodology in front of me, so I can't tell you it's flawed. That would be overclaiming, and I won't do that. What I can tell you is that an environmental review commissioned by the same government trying to get its own plant approved is not automatically an independent finding. It's a finding that needs its assumptions checked before anyone treats it as settled science. Enclosed bays are exactly the kind of water body where salinity doesn't flush out quickly. There's limited circulation, limited exchange with open ocean, and a slow residence time for whatever gets dumped in. That's the technology fit question nobody's answering cleanly yet. Desalination brine discharge is a legitimate, commonly used process in the right hydrology. Whether Corpus Christi Bay's specific circulation pattern is the right hydrology for it at the volumes proposed is a separate question from whether the plant is a good idea in general. And that's the kind of distinction that gets flattened every time this gets reduced to cost versus environment in a headline. Let's talk about who actually pays for any of this, because the accountability trail here is almost funnier than the cost overruns, in a bleak way. Internal city documents obtained by investigators showed that residential customers using an average of 6,000 gallons a month would see an $8.04 monthly rate increase for 10 years if the project gets fully canceled. If it continues, that same household pays $11.38. The difference between we build the billion-dollar plant and we scrap it entirely is $3.34 a month for the average resident. $3 and change is the entire spread between two outcomes that have been fought over in 15-hour council meetings. Meanwhile, and this is the part that should actually make you angry, large industrial and wholesale customers outside city limits pay nothing under the cancellation scenario. because of how the Public Utility Commission's rate methodology is structured. So the group whose expanding demand largely created the pressure for this plant in the first place is shielded from the cost of undoing it, and the residential ratepayer inside the city eats the bill either way. That's not a drought consequence. That's a rate design choice, sitting quietly underneath a much louder fight about brine and concrete. Now here's a side branch that connects back harder than you'd expect. While all of this was happening inside City Hall, Corpus Christi got into an open dispute with a smaller upstream neighbor, Three Rivers, Texas, over water from that same shrinking choke Canyon Reservoir. Three Rivers put out a public notice saying Corpus Christi had made inaccurate water projections and then abruptly changed reservoir releases in a way that cut off Three Rivers' access to Choke Canyon water it had been told back in January would last until April or May of 2027. Corpus Christi's response was that there had been no operational change at all, that their models are regularly updated, that they remain in full compliance with their TCEQ water rights, and that they'd actually warned Three Rivers as early as January 7th of 2026, and again in a March 10th meeting, that a level 1 water emergency was projected by November. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Corpus Christi can have technically warned Three Rivers months in advance, and Three Rivers can still legitimately experience the final cutoff notice as sudden if the gap between here's a general projection and here's your actual shutoff date wasn't communicated with enough specificity or lead time to plan around. That's not a legal violation. That's a monitoring and communication gap wearing a compliance memo as a disguise. And I'd bet money, though I want to be careful here because I don't have confirmation of the final resolution, that this exact pattern, technically warned but functionally blindsided, is happening in more small towns tied to this reservoir system than just Three Rivers. So now you've got a billion-dollar plant that can't hold a stable price or a stable vote, a brine discharge plan whose safety study was paid for by the party that wants it approved, and a downstream neighbor dispute that shows the city's own internal warnings aren't landing the way officials think they are. And then, on top of all of that, a brand new player shows up. Before Axe H2O ever showed up, there was another maneuver that barely made headlines outside Texas, and it might be the most telling one in this entire story. After killing its own plant in September, the council actually tried to buy an existing desalination plant outright, a facility called Corpus Christi Polymers, an industrial site that already had desalination capacity built and operating for its own use. The city made an offer for it. That offer was rejected in October. Sit with that for a second. In roughly a 12-month window, this city tried 3 fundamentally different strategies to solve the same problem: build a plant from scratch, buy someone else's finished plant, then contract a 2-month-old company to build a bigger one. That's not one failed plan getting revised. That's 3 separate plans failing in sequence, each one launched before the last one's failure had even been fully explained to the public. A company called Axe H2O, at the time of its proposal roughly 2 months old, pitched a natural gas-powered desalination facility capable of 150 million gallons a day, at around $6.50 per 1,000 gallons, about 30% cheaper than reviving the Inner Harbor plant. The council voted 6-2 just to begin preliminary talks. I want to be straight with you about my reaction to that because cheaper and faster sounds great on its face. But think about the sequence we just walked through. A decade of design work, a permanent, fully permitted process that took 5 years just to get its permits, an 8 times cost escalation, 3 reversed votes, and now, in the middle of that mess, a 2-month-old company appears offering a bigger, cheaper version of the exact same category of solution. That's not automatically a scam, and I'm not calling it one. I don't have evidence of that, and I won't manufacture any. But it is exactly the moment where a water system that has spent a decade skipping the diagnose first, build second discipline is most vulnerable to doing it again, just with a shinier number attached. A permit takes years for a reason. If this company's timeline, financing, and permitting pathway haven't been fully verified yet, cheaper is not the same claim as real. And those two things are getting blurred in the coverage. Step back from the money for a second, because I think the physical picture is actually the most honest part of this entire case. Since August of 2024, roughly 318,000 residents inside the city limits have been living under a lawn watering ban, no watering grass, restricted garden, and car washing use for almost 2 straight years now. That's the boring, unglamorous, day-to-day symbol of this crisis, and it's been running the entire time the desalination fight has been happening in council chambers. And here's the detail that ties the whole thing together. No new water source has come online for this system since 2016. Not one. Meanwhile, industrial demand, refineries, petrochemical plants, the largest oil export hub in the country sitting right there, has kept expanding, consuming more than half the city's total water supply. This is really the title of this whole video, so let me spell it out plainly. Every solution this city has tried traces back to the same unsolved problem, and none of them have actually solved it. The Mary Roads pipeline, built years ago to haul water in from the Colorado River basin, was supposed to diversify supply. It did, but it's still ultimately dependent on rainfall somewhere else's watershed. Extra draws from Lake Texana in the Lavaca Navidad basin were supposed to be a buffer. Texana itself dropped from 90% to 54% capacity in about 6 months once Corpus Christi leaned on it harder. Officials have floated reclaiming treated wastewater as another partial fix, which is a legitimate technology used successfully elsewhere, but it hasn't been built at meaningful scale here yet either. So every single proposed fix, the original Inner Harbor plant, the revived 979 million version, the rejected polymers purchase, Axe H2O's pitch, continued reliance on the Mary Roads pipeline, extra draws from Lake Texana. Every one of those is a different machine bolted onto the exact same unchanged demand curve. Nobody in any of these meetings has seriously reduced industrial draw. Nobody has diversified toward a supply source that isn't ultimately dependent on rainfall somewhere upstream. They keep redesigning the pump. Nobody's touched the faucet. That's the professional standard of care violation underneath all of it, and it's not really about desalination technology at all. Desalination can be a completely legitimate tool. The failure is sequence. A competent water utility diagnoses the actual supply and demand gap first, locks a stable design second, secures financing and permits third, and only then builds. What actually happened here was propose a plant before the diagnosis was fully stable, let the estimate balloon nearly 8 times over 6 years, while the underlying scope kept shifting. Cancel it at 10% design completion after burning $50 million, revive the same concept 9 months later at almost the same price, then walk away from federal grant money that could have offset it, all while a 4-year, publicly visible drought kept draining the actual asset everyone was supposedly trying to protect. You don't get to act shocked by the price tag on infrastructure you've spent a decade redesigning by committee. This was never a mysterious environmental surprise, and I don't think anyone who's been watching this reservoir chart for the last 4 years can honestly call it one. It's the predictable output of industrial water commitments written for a wetter decade, a permitting and procurement process that never held a stable position long enough to get built, and a communication gap between a big city and its smaller neighbors that keeps turning technical compliance into functional surprise. The chemistry, in this case, is really just accounting and rainfall, and neither one of those cares how many midnight votes get held about it. Here's where it actually stands right now. The boat ramps are still sitting on dry grass. The lawn ban is still in effect, going on 2 years. No new water source has been added to this system since 2016, and the industrial demand that outgrew it hasn't shrunk by a drop. The reservoirs will refill someday, eventually, because that's what reservoirs do when the rain finally comes back. But the system built around them still hasn't changed at all, and that's the part nobody wants to put in a press release. The lake doesn't need Corpus Christi to agree on a contractor. It just needs rain that the city's own contracts were never built to wait for.